All right, so our next section that we're going to talk about is is hearing and auditory information and how we get information in and then start to process it. And so let's go ahead and get started. So this is kind of just the start of the biology of hearing. Okay, as we all know, probably know, we hear primarily through our ears. And again, if we look at it from what we've talked about, we have three components of the ear. We have the outer ear, which really captures sound. We have the middle ear that has to deal with vibrations. And then we have the inner ear that connects those sensations to the nervous system itself. Okay, so sound waves from music enter the outer ear, makes the eardrum vibrate. The drum is right here. And then those vibrations then send pressure, different waves of pressure into the inner ear, where we have these kind of flange hair-like things that then vibrate at certain tones. Okay. And then this information, then, if it's strong enough and the vibrations are strong enough, will produce an electrical impulse and send it to the primary auditory cortexes within the brain. Okay. So again, just to kind of review, the receptors in the ear detect sound waves from the ear to the brain. The process of hearing begins when sound waves arrive at the shell-shaped structure of the outer ear. Okay. The shell shape of the outer ear increases the ear's ability to capture sound. That's really what it is. It's kind of, if you want to think about it, your ear is a mouth for sound, if that makes any sense. And then it funnels it and it kind of tunnels it into the auditory canal, where that sound then becomes refined as it hits the eardrum. Okay, so the eardrum, the different parts of the system is that sound comes in, starts hitting on the eardrum, which is a thin membrane that marks the beginning of what we call the middle ear, and sound waves cause the eardrum then to vibrate. Okay, and then what happens next is it goes to the cochlea, which is a coiled, bony, fluid-filled tube in the inner ear, and this is what houses the sensory receptors. Okay, where there are pretty much what we call kind of hair cells, which are the sensory receptors located in the cochlea that detect the sound waves and then transduce them into a signal that ultimately are processed by the sound in our brain. Okay, so there's different processes, and if you've ever heard of someone busting their eardrum, instead of getting the clear, crisp sounds that we hear, it can come in kind of a buzzing and disorderly way, because that's the first refinement of sound we have before it enters into the cochlea, where the sound is then processed. So just some advice on how can you avoid damaging your ear. And one of the main ways that we have found we damage our ears is the use of earphones. We should say that, you know, hearing loss due to earbuds and those affects about 5 million young people a year. Nearly 13% of American children between the age of 6 and 19. Okay, just some simple rules to follow in order to protect noise loss is the use of what's called the 60-60 rule. Okay, meaning that you don't constantly hear a sound for more than 60 or so seconds. And when you start to hear ringing in your ears, that's actually not sound entering your ear. When you hear ringing in your ear, it's your ear itself. It's the sensory cells going, hey, this is too much and too intense. And then it's time to walk away from that noise. So when you hear ringing, it's not actually coming from the external environment. It's an alarm system that is located in our cochlea that warns us that the sound is too intense. Okay. So here are some things to consider when we look at damage to hearing from listening to loud music. Okay. Noise in the environment. So this is the loudness in decibels and the amount we should limit ourselves to. Okay. So examples of dish whispers, normal conversation in dishwashers range between 30 to 70 decibels. And that's safe for any length of time. For a vehicle, driving in a vehicle, it's at about 85 decibels. And listen duration after about 80 hours driving in a car can start to damage the ear. And this is what brings me back to the comment I made earlier when we started, that a lot of long haul truck drivers tend to get damage to their ear because of that constant traffic noise. Okay. We shouldn't mow our lawn for more than 2 hours. I don't think that's a huge issue here in Southern Arizona, at least. Maybe some of our colleagues and peers from other states may have this issue. Earbuds and headphones to listen to music and smartphone tends to be at 110 decibels. And this is relatively short. You should probably limit that to about 5 minutes, or make sure you have the sound down to a audible level so that you should be able to hear other people talk to you. A good way to measure this is when you have earbuds and listening to music, you should be able to hear other people talk to you clearly. That indicates that you have it to a reasonable level, that it won't hurt you as much by extending it to 5 minutes. The average rock concert, if you've ever noticed at a rock concert, you often leave with your ears ringing and they feel a little bit numb. That's because the common decibel is between 95 to 115. And about 2 minutes is what it takes to cause any type of hearing damage, especially if you go to concerts constantly. Okay. And then sirens, less than 1 minute. And then the big ones that we should try to avoid without some type of ear protection are jet engines, gunshots, and rocket launches. Those can cause immediate damage if the ear is not protected in some way. Okay. So how do we detect sound waves based on the aspect of the physical aspect? Loudness and pitch. The height of the sound wave is called the amplitude, and the amplitude determines the perception of loudness. So how loud something is determined upon amplitude. The distance between the two peaks of the sound wave is what's called the wavelength. And the time between peaks in a wavelength is the frequency, okay? And the way to think about frequency is this determines the pitch, okay? Whether it's a high pitch or a low pitch. It is measured by vibrations per sound called hertz, and that's what really measures the wave frequency, okay? So we have loudness and then we have pitch, low pitch, high pitch. You can kind of think about this as bass versus tremble in a lot of ways. So here we have some examples. A high amplitude sound wave creates perceptions of loud noises. So here we have baseline, and then lower amplitudes tend to be much more quieter, okay? Lower frequency sounds create a low pitch, okay, meaning it's more down here on this level. Higher frequency, when the waves get shorter and shorter, it tends to be the higher pitches. So if that makes sense on how that works. When we talk about the type of coding, whenever we talk about coding, what we're saying is we're translating the stimuli in some way that makes it so it's perceptible to the individual. So we have two types of coding sound. We have temporal coding and place coding. Temporal coding is the perception of lower pitch sounds is a result of the rate in which the hair cells are stimulated by the sound waves, okay? Whereas place coding is a perception of higher pitches depending on the point on which the basal membrane, where the hair cellular are stimulated by sound waves at very higher frequency. So when we listen to high frequency, a different process takes place. The lower ends of the membrane start to vibrate. Whereas with lower ones, the hair cell itself waves, but it doesn't affect the membrane in itself. So that's kind of how that works. It's kind of like if you kind of pull your hair, right, either on your arm or your head, low frequency would be just moving the hair back and forth. High frequency would be pulling your hair to where it pulls the skin back and forth. We also, other physical aspects is the ear estimates the location of sound based on first on where the sound arrives and second on the amplitude or intensity of the sound wave. So when we look at localization, so is the sound behind us, in front of us, to the right or to the left, there's three kind of things, three ways that the ear locates that sound, okay? Is one, the location of the sound is based on where the sound is arriving. So front or back, it's if it's entering the ear from the waves from the back of the head to the front. But then the second way it does is through amplitude intensity. So the distance of where that sound is coming from is based on how loud it is or the amplitude of the sound wave. So here's an example of a physical aspect of sound. Source, you hear your cell phone the second you reach your left ear first, because that is where the location of the sound is coming from. This cue indicates that the sound is closer to the left. The sound reaches the right ear second, hence we don't see it as that. So that is kind of what the location of that is. And a good example is when a owl locates a mouse, they tend to do it through hearing first, and they use this same process to locate where their prey may be. The other thing that is kind of cool about our hearing system, which is to me, it's really interesting, is that's where we get our sense of balance. What balances us out, the tool that that makes it so we can stand up straight and move forward, is located in is known as the vestibular sense. The vestibular sense is using information from receptors in the inner ear in that semicircular canal. Let me see if, and what that is it's kind of like, if you want to think about it, there's fluid in both of those areas. And when you tip your head one way, your body wants to bring it back to balance because the liquid in it is starting to move. And the idea is the liquid in there wants to keep a homeostatic or a level amount, and that's kind of the idea. Hence, when you spin in a circle round and round and round, that fluid is being extended into one area of the canal. Hence, when we get done circling around, all that fluid is shaking. And that's why we can't walk very straight when we go in a circle several times. All right, so that's hearing. So let's go on to how are you able to taste and smell? And this is an olfactory process dealing with the mouth and the nasal area. Okay. Now, for taste, it's a chemical reaction. So we smell and we taste because of chemicals that are entering our ears, not our ears, oh my goodness, our nose and our mouth. And when certain types of chemicals hit certain types of receptors, that's what sends the signal back to our head. So here we have the example of a lemon on the palate of the tongue, and there's certain sensory areas on the tongue that is really sensitive to sour. And then of course those are then ignited and send that electrical impulse to this gustorial area of the brain that we went over on Monday. And that gives us our reaction of sourness. We respond to it. Human beings are naturally aversive to sour tastes. And so when you know someone who likes sour stuff, they're basically overcoming that aversion, which in turn releases endorphins in the person's body. So so people who like sour foods, they're actually more addicted to the endorphin than the actual sourness of the lime or the lemon. Okay. So as mentioned, this is a chemical reaction that is going on. So the taste buds, their structures located on the palate of the tongue that contain sensory receptors. Structures on the contain taste, a grouping of taste. So each area of your tongue responds to a different type of taste, such as sour, sweet, and such. The taste information sent to the brain region, primarily the facial nerve area. Okay. After processing by the thalamus, the information is then processed more by the gustorial cortex. Okay. So this is just an example how everything runs through the limbic system. And it's probably a good thing, because if we put something bad for us in our mouth, we need to instantly get rid of it. And then it's sent to the higher cortical areas where we either go, that was delicious, or that I'm glad I just spit that out. Okay. We have 5 main types of taste. We have sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and what's called umami, or what is also known in English as a savory or a yummy type of taste. And this has actually been something kind of recent. It's only been since about 2007 that we've recognized that we have taste buds that actually respond to savory types of food. Okay. Super tasters are highly aware of flavors, textures, or more likely to than others to feel pain when eating very spicy foods. Okay. So when what this is it gives us a range of individuals. There's some people who have very low taste abilities. In fact, they have a hard time tasting at all. When we looked at COVID, people who lost the sense of smell and taste, basically those chemical receptors stopped receiving chemical information. And even though the brain said we have to be tasting something, it guessed that it was tasting something bland like cardboard. Okay. So we have individuals with very low taste abilities, and then individuals who have very sensitive receptive cells. Just like with vision, there's some people with 20/20 vision, and there's some people with worse or better vision, if you want to think about it that way. Okay, and as mentioned, texture of food affects taste preferences. These are some things outside of the chemical detection that affect whether we like something or not. So for example, textures, I can't stand cottage cheese, but I like that kind of cheese if it's not in the cottage form because of the texture of it, not necessarily because of the taste. Whether food causes some type of discomfort, this is where we get into like spicy chilies and the level you can get to. And we have found that cultural influences on food preferences begin in the womb. So people with cultural tastes, such as Italy with pastas, with Eastern countries dealing rice and more spicy types of foods, those all start to happen in the womb, because believe it or not, the developing infant in the womb can actually start tasting at a very early time when the brain and the gusturial systems start to connect with each other. And it's a two-way road. We know that infants' taste preferences affect mothers. So if the infant is developing some type of preference, they will have that preference later in life, and so will mom. And this is where the ideas of cravings during pregnancy comes from. Okay. Let's get that. Now let's talk about olfactories. Okay. And olfactory systems, we have to say we don't have one of the best. There's definitely animals who can detect a lot more olfactory senses than we can. And one example is a dog. Dogs primarily use their olfactory system for communication and not so much their vision systems. Their vision systems are actually not that adaptable. Okay. So for a dog, they have 40 times more olfactory receptors than a human do. If you think about this, dogs are 100,000 times to 1 million times more sensitive to odors than humans. And humans, on the other hand, have a much more acute vision system. Now, I do want to say this. Once I learned that this was a chemical reaction, that when something goes up my nose, there's chemicals, and that's what makes me smell, I stopped chewing gum in the bathroom, because I realized that all the farts and everything that I'm smelling is getting stuck in the gum that I'm chewing. And so when you're leaving the bathroom and you were chewing gum in the bathroom, you're chewing your farts when you leave. Just something to think about. That's what I thought about when I was learning about this stuff in undergraduate school. So again, just like the taste receptors, we have chemical receptors within the nasal passage, and that then sends information through. And this one is much like the visual system. So we have the cells here, and then we have this ganglia cell that combines information from different olfactory systems and then sends that signal to the olfactory nerve, okay, which is then perceived right at this location here. So odor is really what is being detected. So what we have two kinds of things we should cover: olfactory influence and olfactory bulb. This is a thin layer of tissue within the nasal cavity containing the receptors themselves. These sensory receptors produce information that then are sent to the brain as a smell, okay? And these chemical molecules that we can smell are what's called odorants. So if you think of the word deodorant, it's decontaminating, or it's trying to get rid of those chemical molecules that produce armpit smell, as an example. Olfactory bulb is the brain structure above the olfactory influence in the nasal cavity. From this structure is where the olfactory nerve carries the information of smell to the primary olfactory cortex. Now, smell has an interesting thing for humans and for other species, is that it is one of the only systems that do not go through the thalamus or the limbic system. It's directly sensed by the cortex itself. And we think there's a couple reasons why. Humans are not immune to pheromones. There's certain smells that when we smell them, we can be more, start producing things like oxytocin, which is our attraction chemical. When we get to attraction, we'll talk about the smell of sweaty men's shirts versus the smell of a laundered shirt, in which creates more attraction. I don't think you're going to like the answer, but that's a cliffhanger for that time. But we also know in other animals who have similar brains that they are heavily influenced by pheromones. In that, that's why, again, our dogs smell other dogs, because the pheromones that are being released tell the dog how that person is doing. They don't need to talk about, so how are you doing today? The pheromones that are being released instantly tell the dog that it's having a good day, it's happy or sad, it's glad, it's good. And so smell has that unique capabilities, both in humans and within animals, but it has been studied a lot more in animals than humans, which I think is kind of interesting. Variety of smells. There are thousands of olfactory receptors, but there are only about 350 types of receptors. Each receptor responds to a different odor. So we have odorants for each different ones. Now, remember, when we look at dogs, their receptors, they have thousands of them. So if you want to think of that as far as acuity is concerned. According to recent estimates, humans can distinguish more than 1 trillion different types of odors just based on these 350 types of receptors and how they combine when they enter our nasal air cavity. And some of the dealing with perception, we know that information about whether a smell is pleasant or unpleasant, that's processed primarily in the prefrontal cortex. This is why, for example, infants in infancy and through childhood, you smell a child and they either have a dirty diaper, or you could smell a child who is 5, 6, 7 years old, and you can tell they haven't taken their bath in a long time. And then with teenagers, I think there's a famous song about teenagers and smell. I can't remember the band, Teen Spirit, I think it was. And they can't recognize that.
Nirvana.
Yeah. I always think about that when I see that video. I'm like, oh, that's what it's talking about. But I know it's probably something else. But but the reason why, and I know we all kind of say, can you smell yourself, to teenagers and young children and infants and stuff like that? And the answer is no, they really can't. Because remember that the prefrontal cortex doesn't become fully developed until we're around 18, 19, or 20 or so. And that's when we really start recognizing that we need to use deodorant and we need to shower more often and those kinds of things. Now, again, there's some variation in this. So there's younger people who that part of the frontal cortex is developing a little quicker than the rest of us. And so that's something to keep in mind when we've got to keep variability in mind. The smell intensity is actually processed by the amygdala. And this is probably very important, okay? Is one, we should note that most people are pretty bad at identifying odors by names, but we can determine them by whether they're nauseous or unnauseous. Women tend to be better at detecting smell than men are. And I think we've probably all seen that socially as well. But one of the things I want to go back to the amygdala, okay? Because the amygdala, it's considered the emotion area of the brain, but it primarily responds to emotions that stimuli in the environment that are presenting a danger to the organism. So its primary response is emotions like fear, okay? And if you think about that, if you have a smell like you're smelling smoke, or you're smelling something really nauseous, it's important for that information to go to the amygdala right away so that the body will respond to it very quickly. All right, so that smell, wow, we are going to get through this today. All right, let's talk about issues dealing with touch and pain, okay? So our main organ for touch is the skin. In fact, when we look at what is the largest organ of the body, it is your skin system, because your skin system has a lot of things not only protecting us, but it's also a big sensor for the system. Okay, so we have in our skin system, we have warm receptors in the skin that detect temperature, and we also have cold sensors. So for example, if you have a thing of hot water on one side and a cold water, you stick your left hand in one, your right hand in the other, you can tell the difference between those because they're turning on different types of receptors, okay? And then we have what are known as pressure receptors. This is how we understand things like touch, okay? Touch information travels, again, all of this information travels through the thalamus to make sure if we need an instant response, like putting our hand on a stove, and then goes to the primary somatosensory cortex, which then tells the body further action to take based upon the reception of hot, cold, or pressure. The sensation of touch above the neck is sent to the brain directly via the cranial nerve. However, any other sensations below the neck, the sensations of touch below the neck go through the spinal cord, okay? And that's why the further we get away from the head region down to our leg region, we become less sensitive to pressure and touch and those kinds of things, because it takes longer for that information to reach the central nervous system. So this is an example. Physical stimuli, ice being put on someone. This is going to ignite pain receptors. It's also going to ignite cold or heat receptors. And then this information is put into one single nerve, which then goes to the cranial area, which says, hey, let's get out of here. The thalamus, which regulates body temperature. And then the primary cortex, sensory cortex, which tells us what we should do motorly as far as movement. Okay. So perception of touch. We actually discovered that electrical stimuli to the primary somatosensory cortex evolves the perception of touch. Okay. For most sensitive regions of the body, such as the lips and the fingers, a great deal of the cortex is dedicated just to processing touch, unlike the other sensory systems. Interestingly, I should tell you, when we look at why is our head and stuff so sensitive, and especially our lips to touch, and there has been a huge debate about why human beings kiss. And science, to be honest for you, science has not given a reason why someone kisses us and our brain loves it. The dopaminergic areas of the brain open up, the endorphin areas of the brain open up, but we haven't figured out why, because if you think about it from a biological survival perspective, it doesn't promote survival in any way. But when we look at the lip region, it does a couple things. One, it detects pressure, it detects heat, it detects warmth, but also there's a chemical transaction that is occurring. And what we have found is that, for example, we're much more accurate about how someone is feeling after we kiss them, because all of those sensory information is processing us, and it goes up to the social areas of the brain and says, this person is sick, this person is well, this person is healthy, this person is all of those things just by kissing. Hence, when you said, I don't feel good, and your grandma came and kissed you on the forehead, she was basically being your thermostat, validating what you were saying, going through kind of their brain was processing the information and telling her how you are actually feeling and validating whether or not you do or not. And this is kind of why sometimes when you're in an intimate relationship and the person says they love you all the time and do all this, but when you kiss them, you feel like there's something off, that you're not quite feeling that connection. Pay attention to that, because that suggests that that individual is not producing the pheromones and the oxytocin that once was present when they were actually truly in love with you. So just an interesting side note about lips and mouths and touch and chemical transmissions, okay? The other thing that our skin does as far as detecting temperature and pressure is kinesthetic sense. Kinesthetic sense tells us how the body and limbs are positioned in space. So the skin kind of is the reason. We often think that it's the muscles and all those kinds of things, but it's actually the skin that is telling our muscles and our tendons and our joints where it should be in relation to space and where we are in our environment. We also, when it comes to pain, we have what are called fast and slow fibers, and we have these two types of pain receptors. Fast fibers, sensory receptors in the skin and muscle and organs and membranes, are both in the bones and the joints. These have myelinated fibers. Remember what we said about myelination. It increases the speed of the nerve impulse. And it conveys intense sensory input to the brain. It is perceived as sharp and immediate. The example is in the graphic here. You touch a hot stove, it ignites a fast fiber, and you instantly, almost without thinking about it, move your hand, okay? Then we have slow fibers, and these are largely unmyelinated, and they sense kind of that chronic, dull, steady pain that we often feel. So we have one that denotes immediate danger, and then another one that is constantly processing continued pain through our system. I'm going to actually skip this one. So let's talk about detecting pain in your body. So controlling pain to scratching and reducing perception of pain, such as listening to music, is extremely effective ways of reducing post-operative pain, we have found, perhaps because it helps patients relax. I should note that when we look at when we look at pain, and I just want to make these comments about it, pain tends to be largely partly subjective and partly physical. One of the big areas in psychology right now is what's called health psychology. And most health psychologists work in pain clinics. And because what they do is people who do not respond to pain medication, or become over reliant on pain medication tend to then be seen by a health psychologist who then take you through different techniques, kind of like listening to music or doing some behavior that then, if you want to think about it, distracts the person from their pain, because physical mechanisms such as medications tend not to work for some pain. The thing that I want to express is that does not make the pain real. Okay. A lot of people go, oh, so I have a psychological problem and this pain really isn't there. It actually is there. It's a myth when people say, there's pain, but there's no physical cause of the pain. There is something going on in the body system on a biological level, but at the moment, our best ways to combat it is through psychological mechanisms to help alleviate that pain. Okay. All right. So I'm going to stop sharing. I know I went over.